I never talk about comics. And for a channel that is solely based on Spider-Man, that's pretty appalling. Comics of the 21st century are a dying breed, especially with the rise of more superhero movies in mainstream media. It's easy to discuss and communicate thoughts, feelings, and criticisms about a Hollywood movie with Spider-Man rather than a comic book that only a handful of people have read and care about. Sure, there is an audience for comic lovers, there is an audience for that type of content, but that's never what I was about. I love comics, but I've never really expressed my love for one on here, so I guess this will be a first. I will admit though, I was one of those people that saw the movies first. Spider-Man 2 was introduced to me as a kid, and I've been a Spider-Man lover ever since. I've since gone on to read countless Spider-Man comic books, from patches of the 616 universe, including major story arcs, differing versions of the character like Spider-Gwen, and of course, the Ultimate Comics, which, to this day, is my favourite modern retelling of the character. But one Spider-Man comic stood out to me over the rest, and it still resonates with me to this day. Spider-Man Blue. If you guys have watched my videos for long enough, you know that I am a sucker for romance. In fact, it's probably one of my favourite genres in film. It packs a great deal of emotion, and that's what I'm all there for. I love a good soppy love story, and that's exactly why I love Spider-Man Blue. If you don't know what Spider-Man Blue is, or as you've seen by the title, how this all ties into The Amazing Spider-Man 3, let me explain. Spider-Man Blue is a comic book that came out in 2003 by Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale. The book follows a guilt-ridden Peter Parker on Valentine's Day as he relives the events from the time he was falling in love with Gwen Stacy. The book ultimately is a reflection on how much he loved her, and I think this book really expands on the true feelings of Peter Parker. I think Blue does a good job of reflecting on that relationship in an emotional and impactful way. The book homes in on Peter Parker's fear of loss and grief of the ones that he loves. By the end, we respect and appreciate the relationship he has with Mary Jane all the more, as she relates to Peter comfortingly in the final panels of the book. It's emotional and heartbreaking. Spider-Man Blue is a comic for people who are in love with these characters. It is a love letter to the Spider-Man Gwen Stacy storyline. And not everyone is for a resonation, not everyone is for a story that looks back the same way that I am. But for me, Blue holds a special place in my heart because it refuses to forget the story and the love of Gwen Stacy and the guilt of what he lost and how he lost. Even if you've never read Spider-Man Blue before, some of the things I just touched on may seem quite familiar to you. And that's because in Spider-Man No Way Home, some of these aspects were touched upon with Andrew Garfield's version of the character. No Way Home did a brilliant job of redeeming Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man by elevating his character to open up about the way he felt about the once love of his life, the same way Peter did in the comics. In No Way Home, his mini arc in that film was to prove he had learned from Gwen's death. It was to prove that he wouldn't make the same mistake twice, and that he had fought through the dark times. Thus, saving MJ was a moment that many people saw coming, including myself. However, a necessary moment to really fledge out his character. No doubt, if a TASM 3 were to happen, its core themes would be around love and what it means to love again, and fear and loss and guilt. A potential TASM 3 would definitely tap into the theme of Gwen Stacy's death for sure, especially since that version of the Wallcrawler is now cemented in the idea after Spider-Man No Way Home. Which is why I believe that Spider-Man Blue would make the perfect story for The Amazing Spider-Man 3. Now, just to say that it's a perfect story is gonna get us absolutely nowhere, but I definitely think that the core themes could be adapted for The Amazing Spider-Man 3 pretty well. In fact, I have three main ideas that I think could work if Spider-Man Blue were to be adapted to The Amazing Spider-Man 3. The first idea would be a film that is set far into the future. In fact, it would take place 5 to 10 years after the events of Spider-Man No Way Home. The film would open with a montage of Peter fighting villains over those years. Since No Way Home, he only referenced the fact that he fought the Rhino. This montage will introduce many new villains of this version of the character, adding depth to the world and also potentially giving us a look at some villains that we've never seen on the screen before. Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 4 also had this same idea, adding villains such as Mysterio, who hadn't had a film at that time, Stiltman, and a few others in a montage at the beginning of the film. After the time jump, we will introduce Peter to us again.
Since Andrew Garfield wouldn't have aged much since No Way Home, we can give Peter a beard to really signify this time jump. But the core difference is that we will introduce Shailene Woodley's Mary Jane Watson as the love interest in this film. We will be exploring the start of their relationship, as the film will explore the idea of Peter beginning to love again. MJ will be the first person he falls in love with since Gwen Stacy. But who will be the main villain of this film? That's right, none other than the Green Goblin. Except this time, the character of Harry Osborn will be more of the main focus. As you guys may know, one of my main gripes with TASM 2 is that the film tried to do too many things. Trying to flesh out two villains in one film was a mistake, and both Electro and Goblin suffered from it. So TASM 3 will focus on Harry Osborn as the main antagonist. He will get the main story and will be the villain that is at the forefront. Now, I know what some of you guys are saying. Green Goblin is overdone. He was in Spider-Man 1, partially in Spider-Man 3, TASM 2, and No Way Home. And you know what? You guys are right. Which is why I'd rather focus on the Harry versus Peter aspect of that relationship. This film would be personal, bringing back all the memories of Gwen for Peter. Not just through his new love MJ, but seeing his once best friend, the man who killed the love of his life. Harry will be dying, and his grudge for Peter has not subsided. In fact, the narrative the gentleman feeds him through his years in prison grows more than ever. And in the end, when Harry becomes too weak to fight Spider-Man alone, that's right, the Sinister Six appear, capping off that gentleman storyline that was set up in TASM 1. The Sinister Six will be made up of the villains he fought at the start of the film in the montage, plus Electro and Green Goblin. This way we get a grand finale and a final test for Andrew's Peter. Him finally defeating Harry will act as a metaphorical representation of him finally overcoming those feelings that he's kept away inside. And Mary Jane will show him the light, that there's room to love again. There's room to love after the death of Gwen Stacy. Peter will shave his beard at the end too, as the Peter we all knew and loved from his earlier days breaks through, and the film ends with a happy, resolved, and restored Peter Parker.
The main idea of this plot was to tap into the idea of the memories of Gwen Stacy flushing back into Peter Parker's life. Peter would start experiencing and encountering things that would remind him of Gwen Stacy, similar to how in Spider-Man Blue, Peter was reminded of Gwen Stacy on Valentine's Day. I love how something like this could be betrayed in a potential Amazing Spider-Man 3.
The second idea is more attuned to the comic and is very simple. TASM 3 could take a route that we've never seen in a Spider-Man movie ever before, and that is to take the format and narrative structure of Spider-Man Blue straight from the pages, and have Peter from the future, presumably 5 to 10 years once again post TASM 2, narrate the life he experienced with Gwen Stacy. So very much similar to the comic. And I know what you guys are saying, isn't narrating the events of TASM 1 or TASM 2 pretty redundant since we already seen those things happen in those films? Well, here is the catch. This film would follow the events at the end of TASM 1 right through to the start of TASM 2, exploring that relationship in that time gap. Similar to how the Clone Wars animated series bridged the gap between Star Wars Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith. This way we could bring Emma Stone back as Gwen Stacy and see what they got up to during this time. As we know, by the start of TASM 2, their relationship had been complicated because of the promise Peter made to George Stacy. And maybe this theme could play a big part too. Peter of the present, who is narrating this story to us, would feel regretful that he didn't just tell her how he felt and spent as much time with her as possible, but would ponder that if he just left her alone and stuck to his promise, maybe she wouldn't have died. This film would be a character study of Peter Parker, really digging deep into his emotional regret and trauma brought on by the death of Gwen Stacy. The film's villain could be someone like the Chameleon, who plays with Peter's mind. And since the Chameleon can shapeshift into anyone he wants, we could potentially play with the idea of him transforming into someone like George Stacy to mess with the police and to fuel the idea to why Peter was haunted by him throughout TASM 2. Maybe seeing him alive and in the flesh again messed with Peter, so it gives him visions of him during the events of The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Mary Jane would also be a main character throughout the film and would be one of Gwen Stacy's best friends. She is a grade above Gwen and Peter at school, thus she moves upstate for college towards Act 3. However, during their interactions, we get hints that Peter and MJ have a lot of chemistry with each other, similar to how Blue had scenes between Gwen, Harry, MJ, and Peter in their teenage years. But by the end of the film, just like in Spider-Man Blue, it is revealed to us that he is with or even engaged to Mary Jane Watson in the present, and that he is remembering the life he had with Gwen Stacy.
Obviously, you can see that this plot takes heavy inspiration from what the comic is itself, but you can tell how it would really work for the character. The idea of Peter 5 or even 10 years into the future narrating his past life is something that we've actually never seen before, not in the movies, not in the shows, and never even in the games. It's only something that we've ever come across in the comics in Spider-Man Blue. So I think in The Amazing Spider-Man 3 it would be really interesting to see how they would handle something like going 5 or 10 years into the future.
My third and final idea is probably the most out there, but I feel like it could work. This version of TASM 3 would take place before Spider-Man No Way Home. Both the previous two ideas have been rooted in a future Peter Parker reflecting on his life with Gwen Stacy, but this version of the story will see us exploring more of the idea of Peter being rageful and bitter, and would base the story off this line in No Way Home.
I stopped pulling my punches. I got rageful. I got bitter.
I think this would make a really interesting film. But then you're asking, how does Spider-Man Blue tie into all of this? Although only lightly taking inspiration from the comic, unlike the two other plots I proposed, this film will still tap into the idea of remembering Gwen Stacy. The film will start with the Rhino fight from TASM 2, and for the majority of the first act, Peter will begin his regression and downfall. Spider-Man may be back, but the thought of Gwen Stacy doesn't disappear. Everything starts reminding Peter of her, even the small things. The film will explore the downfall of Peter Parker, in which we will also introduce none other than the symbiote. Peter will start to bottle up his emotions, which is why the symbiote fits this story so perfectly. The Venom symbiote would be a perfect way for Peter to become rageful and bitter. He won't pull any of his punches and will become violent. Now here's the catch. In No Way Home, when Toby mentions he fought Venom, Andrew doesn't bat an eyelid. That's because this version of the symbiote story won't lead to Venom. Not yet. Green Goblin will be the main villain of the film, but more in a vein of what I mentioned in my first idea. Harry will be out for revenge, which is where the motive to kill Peter will come from. During the end of Act 2, Peter will almost kill Harry in a fight until he realizes what he's become. He's no better than Harry if he kills him just like Harry killed Gwen. And this is where Peter's redemption begins, becoming more like the Peter that we see in Spider-Man No Way Home. I imagine Aunt May will also have a big part to play in bringing Peter back to the light too. And thus, Peter gets rid of the symbiote at the start of Act 3, and he also defeats Harry without the symbiote to represent his redemption. Getting rid of the symbiote would also represent him moving on from his anger and his bitterness. At the end of the film, Peter gets proper help and sees a therapist, in which she tells him to start tape recording his feelings to start letting them out, obviously referencing back to how Peter dealt with Gwen's death in Spider-Man Blue, just to give it that little bit of comic accuracy.
Obviously, this idea may not ever work logistically, but it's still an idea. Also, we have to consider that this opens the door for a potential TASM 4 where we could introduce Venom as the main villain, which is something I think would be pretty interesting to see Andrew Garfield go up against. I think it would also be interesting to see Spider-Man go up against someone who is the literal manifestation of his inner demons. It would literally be the final showdown between Peter's past and Peter of the future. And since the symbiote story was never resolved in this plot, it does open that door for future films. But that is it for my ideas for The Amazing Spider-Man 3 based off the comic Spider-Man Blue. In the end, I feel like The Amazing Spider-Man 3 would make a perfect Spider-Man Blue adaptation. Just purely how the core themes and ideas are integrated into that version of the character. They almost go hand in hand perfectly. Andrew Garfield also has an amazing emotional range when it comes to acting, so this is a role that he could definitely pull off. At the end of the day, a part of me just wishes that we get the final send-off for Andrew Garfield's version of Spider-Man that he and everyone else rightfully deserves. His movies were cut short, and yes, he got his appearance in Spider-Man No Way Home and redemption to some extent when he saved MJ, but personally, I would really like a third film in his series to really cap off that character. But until that day comes, all we can do is hold on to hope. I just want to show you this real quick, actually. Look at this setup that we got going on here. There's the... I hope you guys like the background. But I've got pillows as my soundproofing because I don't have any soundboards and it's really echoey in the new studio. Yeah. Like and subscribe. #MateTasman3.